The Jets beat the Jacksonville Jaguars in a game that perfectly describes the 2024 New York Jets. Let's break down this win today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, December 16th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from ganggreennation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. This season, you can get a big return on FanDuel because new customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, we're here to recap a Jets win. Very rare to say that on a Monday, but the Jets defeated the Jacksonville Jaguars yesterday, 32-25 in Jacksonville, to improve their record to 4-10 on the season. We're going to talk about the conflicted feelings a lot of Jets fans may have, because I know a lot of Jets fans were hoping that the team would win. We'll also talk about the Jets GM search, which has its first couple of candidates. But we're going to start by talking about this game. And in many ways, I think this game perfectly encapsulates the type of team the 2024 New York Jets are. And that's not because they won, because obviously this is a very bad football team. And I think that we can all agree, I hope we can all agree before we get deeper into this, that a last-minute win over the 3-10 Jacksonville Jaguars should not radically alter the Jets' plans for next season. They should not be running it back with Aaron Rodgers, and the rest of the crew, right? We can all agree to that. Okay, now that we've agreed to that, let's move on and talk about this game. This was not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination for the New York Jets, aside from one player who completely dominated this game, who took this game over in the final 4 minutes, and that player was Devonte Adams. In this game, you saw many of the flaws in the 2024 Jets, many of the flaws that have popped up through the course of the season, whether you want to talk about the defense. I mean, this was another terrible defensive performance they may have won this game. They may have actually gotten the stop for the first time in a while to close out a win. They may have, with trying to hold the lead late in the fourth quarter, finally delivered a play when Sauce Gardner intercepted Mac Jones. But let's be serious. This was a dreadful performance by the Jets defense. They allowed Mac Jones to throw for 294 yards and 2 touchdowns. And Mac Jones left yards on the field. The only reason Mac Jones did not have an even bigger day was Mac Jones, because there were some throws available to him that he just flat out missed. Throws that probably would have swung the game in Jacksonville's direction. But, they allow Mac Jones to throw for 294 yards. They allow Jacksonville to run for 136 yards on a 4.7 average. I don't think anybody can say that this was a good defensive performance by the Jets. One of the worst offenses in the league, playing a backup quarterback, put 25 points on the board and again, left plays on the field. You can't say it was an offensive masterpiece. The Jets threw it with 32 points. But that was because Devonte Adams went crazy in the last 4 minutes of the game. The Jets were sitting on 17 points with about 4 minutes left. Aaron Rodgers was on about 135 passing yards at that point. So you saw the Jets go toe-to-toe with a team that was 3-10. You saw the Jets go toe-to-toe with a team that's one of the worst teams in the league. And heading into the season, a 3-10 team, you would have thought that would be a team the Jets would destroy, because the Jets were supposed to be one of the best teams in the NFL. As it turns out, the Jets are one of the worst teams in the NFL. And you also saw just dreadful coaching, unimaginably bad decisions by Jeff Ulbrich. For the second straight week, the Jets show they have no idea how to manage the game, because the Jets, after Adams' play that got them down to the 1-yard line late in the fourth quarter. So essentially on a third down play, Aaron Rodgers drifted right. Then he found Devonte Adams wide open in the left flat. He hit him for a short pass, and Adams took that ball 41 yards down to the 1-yard line. The Jets got there with 1:08 left in the fourth quarter. Jacksonville had to burn their first timeout. So Jacksonville only has 2 timeouts. The Jets have the ball on the 1-yard line in a tie game with 1:08 left. I mean, what is the play there? The play there is obviously you just run the clock out, because the Jaguars can only stop it twice. So if you just take the knee 3 times, or run it into the line and make sure you don't go into the end zone, the Jaguars are going to get the ball back with 15 seconds, down 3. All you have to do is run the clock out and kick the field goal, because it's a chip shot. What do the Jets do? The Jets score the touchdown, which gives Jacksonville a chance, which gives Jacksonville the ball back with over a minute left and 2 timeouts. So Jacksonville went from, having 15 seconds to try and generate a field goal drive and drive 40 yards with no timeouts, to having a minute and 8 seconds with 2 timeouts. It gave Jacksonville a chance. Jeff Ulbrich, it's amazing how bad, and I understand that, he never expected to be the head coach of this team. So these were thoughts that probably never entered his head prior to week 6. And, he was thrown into a situation he did not ask for. But don't you have to understand basic things about managing the game? Jets were sloppy through this game. 8 penalties, especially in the first half. This was nobody could come away from this and say that this was a stellar performance by the New York Jets. They barely beat one of the worst teams in the league by 7 points, but they got the win. And why did they get the win? Well, that's the other aspect of the Jets. There are players on this team who can make plays. And Devonte Adams, I mean, usually I wouldn't give one guy all the credit for this, but Devonte Adams took this game over in the second half. 189 yards in the second half receiving. 135 yards, 3 catches, 135 yards in the last 4 minutes of this game. And those 3 catches, they were all critical catches for this team. The first one was a 71-yard touchdown from Aaron Rodgers, who Adams just got behind the defense, and Rodgers found him. Rodgers threw a great ball. That gave the Jets a 3-point lead after Adams caught a 2-point conversion. Jaguars drive down the field to kick a field goal because Jets defense can't get a stop. Then on a critical 3rd and 10, with 141 left, again, Rodgers throws a perfect ball. So maybe we give Rodgers a little credit, but this was all this was mostly Adams. It's just a perfect ball down the left sideline, and Adams makes a spectacular catch. And I'm still not convinced. I said this on last night's recap show. I'm still not convinced Adams got both feet down, but look, the Jets have had enough calls go against them through the years that I'm not going to apologize for that. Then another 3rd down comes up. Jets, on the outer fringes of field goal range, probably outside field goal range. If they're in field goal range, they're just short of it. They're on the Jacksonville 42-yard line. Rodgers drifts right, finds Adams wide open on the left side. Jaguars bust their coverage, and Adams takes the ball down to the 1-yard line. Devonte Adams, I always, I keep saying, people may start to disagree with me when I say he's not the guy he was in Green Bay, because this looked like the guy he was in Green Bay. There are still moments where he looks like the guy he was in Green Bay, and he's still a very, very effective receiver. And the fact that the fact that this trade has gone so poorly for the Jets, it's not a reflection on how Devonte Adams has played, because Devonte Adams has been very good for the Jets, and he's gotten better as the season's gone on. Even with his chemistry with Rodgers, that famous chemistry, you could tell it took a couple weeks for them to get going. It took a couple weeks for them to shake the rust off, but now they're really functioning at a very high level. And look, the Jets gave up too much for him. He was not a player who ever made sense for the Jets. That trade never should have happened. But you see, this is a guy who still is, at moments, capable of taking over a game. And that's what he did. And the Jets are a bad team. They're not good on offense. They're not good on defense. They're not good on special teams. They're not well coached. There's not really a lot good you can say about this team, aside from the fact that you have individual players who, again, may not be quite what they used to be, but have moments where they look like they were in their prime. And in a fourth quarter, which easily could have gone against the Jets, as so many fourth quarters have gone this year, for once, one of those players stepped up. And that it's there somewhere. It may not be there every single week. This team may not have the talent to win consistently, but somewhere down there's talent enough that you can win the occasional game like this, when everything's on the line, when in the clutch, when the game's hanging in the balance. I don't know how many cliches I can use in a row there. There are guys who can step up occasionally, and it's not enough to make the playoffs. It's not enough to salvage the season. It's not enough for the Jets to be a good team, but it's good enough to beat a team like Jacksonville and remind you, as bad as things have been for the Jets this season, they're not the worst team in the NFL. They might be close, but they're not the worst team in the NFL. Now, I know there are some Jets fans who wish they were the worst team in the NFL, because then they get the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. And I know there are a lot of Jets fans disappointed by yesterday's result. As we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, I'm going to talk to you fans. I'm going to offer some perspective on why this win is not the end of the world. And we'll discuss the implications for the Jets in the NFL draft. That's ahead here on this Monday game recap edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What moments and things make you happy and cozy at home during December? How do you stay cozy during the winter months? For some, wrapping up in a blanket with a mug of hot chocolate or watching a movie with family is the best way to spend the month of December. Well, therapy is a great way to bring yourself into some comfort that never goes away, even when the season changes. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find comfort this December with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by the College Football Playoff on TNT. It's that time of year. The College Football Playoff is back. And with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT Sports' coverage of the College Football Playoff begins December 21st, starting with the College Football Playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern, leading into our first matchup, the Southern Methodist University Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the College Football Playoff presented by Allstate, live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is the daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The Jets beat the Jacksonville Jaguars yesterday, 32-25 in Jacksonville. Of course, that game's not really going to have much of a legacy for the New York Jets. This is a lost season. The win only improves the Jets to 4-10, so they're out of the playoff race. They've been officially eliminated for the last week. They're going to have a losing season, and they're going to have a 10-loss season. At the absolute best case scenario, which would require the Jets to win their final 3 games, all of which they should be underdogs in. The Jets would, if the Jets win out, they match their 7-10 record from last year. So it's been an ugly season, and understandably, a lot of fans have turned their attention to the draft. And this time of year, there's always the divide in the fan base. There's always the debate: should you root for losses to improve the draft position, or should you root for wins? And normally the wins argument is, kind of decorated in the idea that you're trying to build a culture, that you're trying to build momentum for the next season. It's a tough argument to make this year because we know that this Jets team is going to undergo radical changes in the offseason. A lot of older guys are going to be out the door, including the quarterback. We're going to have a new head coach in here next season. We're going to have a new GM in next season. You're not really building a culture to last with these wins. But I understand. Look, the players are still going to go out there and play hard. I understand. There's only 17 games a year. There have been very few enjoyable Sundays for Jets fans this year. If you want to enjoy the win, more power to you. For the tankers out there, yesterday brought some bad news. Now, here's the good news for you tank commanders. The Jets, after week 15, still own the 8th pick in the NFL draft. So they started the week with the 7th pick. They only dropped to 8. So they only dropped 1 slot. And, that's because they beat Jacksonville. But the Jets had enough cushion that they did, they weren't in any real danger of dropping out of the top 10. The other good news for you, again, the Jets probably should be underdogs in their final 3 games. Maybe that home game against Miami, they get favored, but 3 games that are going to be very tough to win for this team going forward. So the Jets have a very good chance of ending with the top 10 pick. The bad news for you tank commanders is, well, it's going to be much tougher to get into the top 5, top 2, or get the number 1 overall pick. I think any hopes of the Jets getting the number 1 overall pick essentially ended yesterday because all the other 3-10 teams lost. New England lost, Jacksonville lost, Carolina lost, Tennessee lost, Cleveland lost, and the Giants, who entered the week 2-11, game quote unquote ahead of the Jets for the top pick, or maybe a game behind the Jets, depending on how you want to look at it. They also lost. So the Jets started the day 3-10, tied with a bunch of teams, and essentially there were 8 teams that were either 2-11 or 3-10 heading into the day. All of those teams lost, aside from the Raiders, who play tonight. So the Jets did not really lose any ground, but it's going to be much tougher to gain ground going forward. So I'm sure a lot of Jets fans are disappointed. I mean, this probably, whatever long shot odds the Jets had of landing Travis Hunter, the Heisman Trophy winner out of Colorado, probably came to an end with this game. There was no guarantee they were going to get him anyway, though. So how do you cope with this? Well, I think it's pretty simple. I think one thing that's been proven through the years in the NFL draft is that it doesn't really matter that much when you pick. There's always an opportunity to get a great player. And you think about some of the worst Jets draft picks through the years, some of the moves that really failed. And we can talk about the quarterback position. They drafted Sam Darnold 3rd overall. They traded up for Sam Darnold they traded up from 6 to 3 that year. They could have stayed put and taken Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson that year. In 2021, the Jets had the 2nd overall pick in the draft. They lost out on the number 1 pick because they beat the Rams, next week's opponent. That was the last time the Jets played the Rams. It was 2020 when the Rams beat them and knocked the Jets out of the number 1 draft pick slot. And yes, they drafted Zach Wilson that year, but they also had a chance to draft Jamar Chase and Penei Sewell if they had wanted to. There's always a great player no matter when you draft. I think back to 2005. This might be the ultimate example. It shows you how different the NFL was just 19 years ago, because in the 2005 season, the player everybody was tanking for was a running back, Reggie Bush. And the Jets won enough games. They won a late season game against the Raiders. They won a late season game against the Bulls, the Bills, that knocked them out of position to be able to draft Reggie Bush. Well, they ended up drafting DeBrickashaw Ferguson 4th overall that year. And DeBrickashaw Ferguson ended up being a better player than Reggie Bush. So you never know. I mean, look, of course, there are years where you would have been better off losing. I think, obviously, an example of that would be the 2007 season where the Jets dropped themselves out of a position to draft Matt Ryan in the 2008 draft. The Jets lost their last game that season against the Kansas City Chiefs. They would have been in a spot to be able to draft Matt Ryan. Instead, they lost. They ended up drafting Vernon Golston. At the same time, there was an opportunity to draft Joe Flacco that year. And there were opportunities to draft other good players at 6 that year. So, I think one thing I've seen over and over in the NFL is that the teams that draft at the top don't always make the best picks. It's the teams with the smart front offices. And I maintain this, that yes, I mean, there probably is some advantage to having, the 6th pick instead of the 8th pick. There's probably some advantage to having the 4th pick over the 6th pick, but it's much smaller than people realize. It's one of the reasons trading down is such a good idea for the most part in the NFL draft, because no matter where you draft in the first round, you have the ability to land a great player. There are more than 32 prospects in the NFL draft who are going to go on to have success. It's a matter of finding them. And yeah, it's a little tougher when you're picking lower, but it's not that much tough. If you drop 2 slots, it really doesn't make things that much tougher. There are only 2 players who go off the board. There's still plenty of great players available. And the person the Jets hire is the general manager. And whether they do their job effectively and whether they build an effective scouting staff, that's going to be far more important than where the Jets pick in each round. I would rather have the 32nd pick with a great front office than the first pick with a lousy front office. And quite frankly, more often than not, the team with the 32nd pick has a great front office, and the team with the first pick has a lousy front office. That's because the team that picks 32nd is the team that won the Super Bowl, and the team that picks first was the worst team in the NFL. A bad GM can screw up a top 10 pick. A bad GM can screw up a top 5 pick. A good GM can nail a pick late in the first round. Whenever teams trade a late first round pick, they act like it's no big deal. They act like you've cost yourself nothing. Late first round pick still has a lot of value because there are great players available there. So this is my little pep talk to everybody who was rooting for the tank. It's not over. We're not folding the franchise because, I mean, there are probably good reasons to fold the franchise based on how things have gone this season. But a win over Jacksonville is not one of them. The Jets dropping to the 8th pick in the draft, that's not a good reason, because at the 8th pick, you're still in the top 10. It's not even like you dropped that far. You still have a top 10 pick. If you can't get a great player at the 8th overall pick, I don't even know what we're doing. Maybe we should fold the franchise then. But it's I think the Jets will survive winning this game. That's the main point of this. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about the GM search because we actually have the first 2 candidates the Jets are going to interview. And I'm not going to lie, my expectations for this GM search are kind of low. I just have one piece of criteria, and both potential candidates meet it. I'll tell you what that piece of criteria is and who the candidates are as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Jets hosting the Rams this coming weekend at the Meadowlands. Despite being at home, the Jets are currently 3-point underdogs on FanDuel to the Rams. The over-under of this game is 46.5 points. So if you think the Jets are going to win, you think the Jets will go on a 2-game winning streak, FanDuel is the place to get in on the action because, again, you get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We've talked about the Jets' victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars and what it means for fans who were rooting for a tank. The Jets' GM search is starting to heat up. On Sunday morning, Adam Schefter of ESPN reported that the Jets will interview their first 2 candidates in the days ahead. One is former Titans general manager John Robinson. The second is Louis Riddick, who is an NFL analyst on ESPN. And look, my expectations aren't super high for this GM search. I understand it's a difficult job to sell. The ownership situation is unstable. First of all, you have Woody Johnson, who has shown himself to be very impulsive, a very difficult guy to work for, a guy who makes it very difficult for his people to win, a guy who doesn't empower his people. and frequently meddles in it frequently meddles in big decisions, which is just the total opposite. Everything you want in an owner, Woody Johnson's the opposite. He does a terrible job, and this makes the job a tough sell. And it's becoming tougher and tougher because Woody's become more erratic in his decision making through the years, and also like people have worked for the Jets and now are going out into the NFL and talking about what the experience is like. It's turning people off. Say what you will about Joe Douglas. You or I may not like the job Joe Douglas did as Jets general manager, but Joe Douglas is very respected in the NFL. Joe Douglas is now going out and he's telling people what happened when he was Jets general manager. Same thing with Robert Saleh. You or I may not like the job Robert Saleh did as Jets head coach, but he's going out there talking about his experiences, which were not good. And in some areas, he's right. And so Robert Saleh doesn't need to be a good head coach for Woody Johnson to have overstepped his bounds in many areas, for Woody Johnson to have shown himself to be a bad owner and a bad guy to work for. That's totally unrelated to Robert Saleh's ability to coach a football team. And Todd Bowles, another guy who's well respected in the NFL, doing some good things with Tampa Bay. He's talked about how bad the Jets ownership situation is. So my expectations aren't super high. I just want someone who's qualified to be a GM. If you could hire somebody who you look on paper and you say, they have the credentials to be a GM, I can live with that. And it's not as easy as you think, because if you look at the guys the Jets have hired as GMs the last couple of times, okay, Joe Douglas, I think everybody thought he was qualified to be a general manager. There wasn't really a lot of debate. Joe Douglas got extensive praise when the Jets hired him. But the two guys who preceded him, he had Mike Maccagnan, who was the Texans director of college scouting. Was he qualified to be a GM? Well, you don't really see many directors of college scouting jump straight to the general manager job. Maccagnan had no experience, no real substantive experience on the pro personnel side, scouting free agents, running the salary cap. Usually you see a guy who's like an assistant GM or a personnel director, somebody who's got experience about the college and pro sides of the business. And Maccagnan did not. And there was some, Maccagnan's hiring met some very mixed reactions. There were some people who liked him, but there were also some question marks about his ability to be a GM. And the same was true of John Idzik, who came from the administration side of things. He ran the salary cap, he ran a lot of the business side of things, but did not really have a big personnel background. Now, I'm not a big believer that you necessarily need a personnel background in today's NFL, but there were a lot of questions when Idzik was hired. Is he a guy who's capable of running a team? And that goes into other issues about the way the Jets ran that search. But the bottom line is that two of the last three guys the Jets hired as general manager, at the time they were hired, there were questions: is this guy qualified to run a team? I think John Robinson's shown he's qualified to run a team. Now, look, you can poke holes in his resume. I'm not going to sit here and make John Robinson out to be a gold jacket Hall of Fame type of executive, but he is a guy who's experienced. He is a guy who has 7 years of experience as a general manager, and in those times, the team he built went 66-48. So this is a guy who's shown an ability, and they made the playoffs 3 times. They made the playoffs more than that. They made the playoffs 4 times in his tenure. They went to an AFC championship game in 2019. They had the 1 seed in 2021 in the AFC. So this is a guy who's shown, if nothing else, he can build a successful football team. Again, not to say he's the greatest GM, not to say his record comes without any questions, but there's a guy who drafted Jack Conklin, Derrick Henry, Kevin Byard, Jeffrey Simmons, AJ Brown. I mean, lots of good players he drafted. You want to throw Amani Hooker in the 4th round into that. You want to throw Harold Landry in the 2nd round into that. A guy who's shown ability to be a capable GM. Now, the Titans are bad because he made a lot of decisions near the end of his tenure, and his drafting the last couple of years was terrible. So I'm not going to sit here and act like he's a perfect candidate. But he's a competent GM. He's shown an ability to do the job effectively, even if he wasn't able to sustain that. Well, if you bring in a guy who actually builds a winning team and then things fall off at the end, that's better than the Jets have had in like 20 years. So I can't, I understand the concerns some people have about him. I don't know that he'd be my first choice. I think he's a guy worth bringing in for an interview. And then you have Louis Riddick, who's been on ESPN for a number of years. He's worked in the Washington front office. He worked in the Philadelphia front office, and then he went into TV. I think he's a really solid analyst. Like I enjoy his perspective. You can never tell. There's some guys who are good on TV who aren't good at running a team. You see that a lot in the coaching profession. How many guys are great analysts in the game who really break down the X's and O's but cannot run a team. But Riddick's a guy. You're not just pulling a guy out of TV. I did a special show yesterday morning, and I mentioned in 2001. The Lions pulled Matt Millen out of the TV booth. Matt Millen was Fox's number 2 analyst. In fact, Matt Millen was on a trajectory to be the number 1 analyst on Fox. He was on track to be in the role Tom Brady's in today, or the role Greg Olsen had, the role Troy Aikman had for many years. Matt Millen was being groomed to take over for John Madden, and then the Lions hired him out of the TV booth. He had no credentials to run a team, and it was a disaster. I mean, the Lions during Matt Millen's tenure are kind of like what the Jets were today, where they were just like completely hopeless. They made moves that made no sense over and over. Matt Millen was in over his head. Louis Riddick's worked in NFL front offices. Again, I think he's a guy who would be, if he had stayed in NFL front offices, he's a guy who would be generating job interviews. And another thing I mentioned that I liked when I talked yesterday is, sometimes when you work for a team, you kind of get tunnel vision. You're so focused on your team's immediate needs, you can't really think about best practices in the league. When you're on TV, you kind of get exposed to the way all 32 teams do things. So you can kind of figure out, you can look at what the good teams do, what the bad teams do, figure out how to integrate the processes the good teams have, avoid the processes the bad teams have. The other thing I really like is been critical of the culture Woody Johnson's built, and that's something Woody needs to hear. And, it may cost him when he interviews, but one thing Riddick has been very vocal about through the years is that the Jets have a terrible culture, and it starts with the owner. And that's something that's absolutely got to change. So in this interview, maybe you'll get a little truth spoken to power. I don't know how much it'll work. I don't know how much it'll change things, but I like that about Louis Riddick. So I would say, look, we'll see what happens. There's still a long way to go in this GM search. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of other candidates along the way, but these are two candidates. Like if you asked me when Joe Douglas was fired, who are candidates the Jets should interview, these would not have been my first choices to hire, but they definitely would have been on my interview list of people who were worth an interview, and the Jets are going to interview them. We'll see who else the Jets interview, but that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.